The biting wind whipped through the high desert pass, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and acrid that Hixson knew all too well. His breath plumed white in the pre-dawn chill as he hunkered beside his mount, the big roan gelding a dark silhouette against the faintest hint of purple on the eastern horizon. Below, nestled in the shallow valley, lay the widow Malcom's ranch, or what was left of it. A week ago, it had been a bustling, albeit modest, operation. Now, the main barn stood a skeletal ruin, its timbers charred black against the pallid sky. 2 other outbuildings were gone, and the fence line was a twisted mockery of its former self. Hixson had been hired to guard an empty ranch, so the message had said. A simple, if desolate, job. Keep scavengers and claim jumpers from picking over the bones until the Malcom estate could be settled. But the widow, stubborn as a badger in a rock slide, refused to leave. He'd found her 2 days prior, a small, defiant figure amidst the wreckage, a double-barrel shotgun cradled in her arms like a favored child. Her name was Clara, and her eyes, though red-rimmed and weary, held a flinty resolve that Hixson recognized. He'd seen it in prospectors who'd hit bedrock, in trapped wolves, and in men facing down a firing squad. He respected it, even if it complicated his already murky assignment. His employer, a slick-haired land speculator named Thorne, wanted the property cleared, its mineral rights quietly secured. The fire, Thorne had implied with a dismissive wave, was a tragic accident, a misfortune that would ultimately benefit Clara Malcom by freeing her from a dying enterprise. Hixson hadn't believed a word of it. The fire had been too thorough, too precise. And the timing, just as rumors of silver ore veins in the foothills intensified, was too convenient. He'd signed on for a guard detail, not an eviction, and certainly not to stand by while a woman was pushed off her land. His gaze swept the surrounding hills, the broken, unforgiving terrain, a perfect stage for ambush. The acrid smell was stronger now, gunpowder, recent. A sharp crack echoed from the valley floor, not a rifle, but the dull thud of an axe splitting wood. Clara. She was trying to salvage what she could, stubborn in her grief. Hixson drew a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and pushed himself up. The roan snorted, shifting its weight. "Easy, boy," Hixson murmured, running a gloved hand over its strong neck. He adjusted the brim of his worn hat, his eyes scanning the ridgeline again. This wasn't going to be a quiet watch. He could feel it in the tightening of his gut, the familiar prickle along his scalp. The warlord, as Thorne was sometimes called by those who knew his methods, wouldn't tolerate delays. And Hixson had just become delay. He started the descent, his boots crunching on scree, a silent promise forming in his mind. He wasn't just guarding an empty ranch anymore. He was guarding Clara. The first volley of shots ripped through the pre-dawn stillness, kicking up dust devils around the remains of the main house. Hixson, halfway down the slope, instinctively dove behind a cluster of granite boulders, the roan shying violently at the sudden noise. He drew his Winchester, levering around into the chamber, his eyes already searching for the muzzle flashes. They came from the north, high up on the opposite ridge, precise and well-aimed. Rifleman, Thorne hadn't wasted time. Hixson counted at least 3. He could hear Clara's frantic shout from the ranch below, followed by the distinctive roar of her double barrel. Brave, but outmatched. He needed to draw fire, give her a chance to find cover, or better yet, make her escape. He sighted on the faintest glint of the scope on the ridge and squeezed off a shot. The report echoed, a sharp retort, against the distant crackle of rifle fire. He saw a brief flurry of movement, then the return fire intensified, focusing on his position. Good. He was a target. He laid down suppressive fire, emptying his magazine, then ducked low to reload. The smooth, practiced motion of his hands, a testament to countless skirmishes. "Clara, get out!" He yelled, his voice raw, hoping she could hear him over the din. He heard another shotgun blast, closer this time, and then silence. A cold dread gripped him. Had they gotten to her? He risked a quick peek over the boulder. Nothing. The ranch yard was shrouded in the lingering smoke of the fires, making it difficult to discern movement. The riflemen on the ridge seemed to be shifting, fanning out, their shots now more sporadic, less concentrated on Hixson's position. They were moving in. He had to assume they were circling around to cut off any escape route Clara might have. He sprang up, dashing across a short, exposed stretch of ground, scrambling behind another, larger rock formation, closer to the valley floor. He moved with the fluid grace of a man who understood terrain, using every dip and rise, every shadowed crevice, to his advantage. As he closed the distance, he heard a new sound, closer this time, the rhythmic thud of horses' hooves. Riders. They weren't just pushing Clara out. They were making sure she wouldn't come back. He reached the edge of the ranch property, a low, crumbling stone wall offering scant cover. Peeking through a gap, he saw them. 4 riders, moving at a trot, their leader a burly man with a distinctive scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Thorne's enforcer, a man named Granger. Hixson knew him by reputation, ruthless, efficient, and utterly devoid of mercy. Granger's men were fanning out, one dismounting to kick open the door to the small, standing cabin, the only structure still mostly intact. A moment later, a triumphant yell. They had her. Hixson's jaw tightened. He had to act. He couldn't let them take her. He checked his rifle, then drew his revolver, its weight familiar and comforting in his hand. The odds were long, but Hixson had faced worse. He moved silently along the stone wall, keeping low, his senses acutely aware of every rustle of dry brush, every shift in the wind. The horsemen, focused on their captive, were momentarily off guard. Hixson took aim at the rider closest to the cabin door, a clean shot to the chest. The man cried out, tumbling from his saddle, his horse bolting in confusion. The other 3 riders spun, startled, their rifles coming up. Hixson fired again, winging another man in the arm. Granger, his face contorted in a snarl, drew his own pistol, but Hixson was already moving, sprinting across the open ground, directly at the cabin. He burst through the flimsy door, slamming it shut behind him, the force of the impact momentarily stunning Granger's men. Inside, Clara stood, defiant, her shotgun pointed at the 2 men who had dragged her from the cabin. She looked at Hixson, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and a flicker of something that might have been gratitude. "Thought you were gone," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "Had some unfinished business," Hixson replied, gesturing with his rifle. "Drop the shotgun, ma'am. Take cover by the hearth." Clara, after a moment's hesitation, obeyed, moving to the sturdy stone fireplace. Hixson took up a position by the single window, peering out. Granger and his remaining man were dismounting, taking cover behind the horses, their rifles spitting fire. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin, splintering wood. "They'll try to smoke us out," Hixson said, reloading his rifle. "Or burn us." Clara, kneeling by the hearth, pulled out a small leather pouch. "Not if we make it too costly," she said, her voice grim. She produced a small, tarnished brass key. "There's a cellar, for canned goods, and a back way out. Used to lead to a spring." Hixson looked at her, a glint of respect in his eyes. The woman was resourceful. "Good," he said, laying down covering fire. "Show me." The cellar was a tight, earthy space, smelling of damp soil and forgotten things. Clara fumbled with the key, her hands trembling slightly, but she quickly found the lock. The trapdoor, cleverly disguised beneath a worn rug, groaned open, revealing a short, ladder-like descent into darkness. "It's a tight squeeze," she warned, her voice barely a whisper, as bullets continued to thud into the cabin above. "But it comes out in the arroyo, just beyond the last fence line. Hixson nodded, his mind racing. This was a gamble, but staying put was a guaranteed death sentence. "You first," he said, motioning her down. He would cover her. He heard Granger's voice, closer now, a low growl. "Inside." "Push it." They were coming in. Clara hesitated for a split second, then scrambled down the rough-hewn ladder, disappearing into the black. Hixson quickly followed, pulling the trapdoor shut behind him, plunging them into suffocating darkness. They moved through the narrow, twisting tunnel, Hixson's hand on Clara's shoulder, guiding her through the oppressive gloom. The sounds of the shootout above faded, replaced by the trickle of water and the scuttling of unseen creatures. It was a perilous escape, but it was an escape. They emerged, gasping, into the fresh, cold air of the arroyo, a deep, dry creek bed carved into the earth. They were well behind Granger's position, hidden by the steep banks and a thick growth of willows. Clara slumped against the sandy bank, her chest heaving, her shotgun still clutched in her hands. "They won't expect us this way," she gasped, wiping a smear of dirt from her cheek. Hixson nodded, already scanning their new surroundings. The arroyo snaked through the badlands, a natural path, but also a potential trap. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll figure it out eventually." They followed the arroyo's winding path, the sun now fully risen, painting the jagged peaks in hues of gold and crimson. The terrain was their ally and their enemy. It offered concealment, but also limited their options, funneling them through narrow defiles. Hixson kept a wary eye on the high ground, knowing Granger would have men scouting the ridgelines. Clara, despite her ordeal, moved with surprising resilience. She knew this land, its hidden shortcuts, its treacherous turns. She pointed out a faint deer trail leading up a particularly steep bank. "This way," she whispered. "Cuts off a good mile and gives us a view of the pass." Hixson admired her instincts. They worked their way up, the climb arduous, the loose scree threatening to give way beneath their feet. From the summit, they could see for miles, a vast, unbroken expanse of desert stretching to the horizon. And in the distance, a plume of smoke. The ranch. Granger had burned it to the ground. Hixson's jaw tightened. Thorne wasn't just driving Clara off her land. He was erasing any trace she'd ever been there. "We need to get to Last Chance Gulch," Clara said, her voice grim. "My cousin runs a small assay office there. He's the only one who might have recorded my father's claim." Hixson looked at her, understanding dawning. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It was about legal proof, about a fight that went beyond the barrel of a gun. "Thorne will have men watching it," Hixson warned. "He's got a long reach." Clara met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "Then we make sure he doesn't see us coming." Hixson nodded. This was no longer just his assignment. It was her fight, and he was in it with her. They pushed onward, the sun climbing higher, beating down on them with relentless intensity. The landscape became a character in itself. The sun-baked earth, the sharp, unforgiving rocks, the sparse, thorny scrub. Water was their most precious commodity, and Hixson rationed it carefully, allowing Clara sips from his canteen. They moved with a practiced efficiency, Hixson scouting ahead, Clara following, her gaze always sweeping the horizon. They ate dried jerky and hardtack, their meals brief and silent. The urgency of their mission, the unspoken threat of Granger's pursuit, hung heavy in the air. As dusk began to settle, casting long, distorted shadows across the land, they found refuge in a small, abandoned prospector's shack, little more than a pile of crumbling rocks and a leaning roof. Hixson carefully built a small, smokeless fire from dried mesquite, its warmth a welcome comfort against the encroaching chill. Clara, examining the crude map she carried, traced a finger across the faded lines. "Last Chance Gulch is 2 days' ride," she murmured. "If we push it." Hixson grunted. "We'll push it." He checked his rifle, cleaning the action, the metallic click a familiar rhythm. Thorn won't give up easily. He wants that silver. Clara looked up, her eyes glinting in the firelight. My father found it years ago. Just a trace, but enough to know it was there. He kept it quiet for our own good. She paused, a shadow passing over her face. He trusted Thorn once. Called him a friend. Hixson didn't comment. He knew the type. Friends were easily discarded when profit was involved. He stood watch for the first half of the night, his senses alert, listening to the desert's myriad sounds. The howl of a coyote, the rustle of a night creature, the whisper of the wind. Nothing seemed out of place, but he knew that in this land, danger often arrived in silence. The next morning, they continued their trek, the terrain growing progressively more rugged. They had to abandon their horses in a hidden canyon, the narrow passes too treacherous for even the sure-footed roam. Now they were on foot, their progress slower, but their stealth greater. They navigated a maze of red rock formations, their figures dwarfed by the towering cliffs. Hixson, ever the pathfinder, led the way, his eyes constantly searching for tracks, for signs of pursuit. Clara, her boots worn and dusty, followed closely, her determination unflagging. She pointed out ancient pictographs etched into the canyon walls, a silent record of those who had passed this way before them. The old ones, she said, her voice hushed. They knew this land. Hixson nodded, a grudging respect for the indigenous knowledge she possessed. Suddenly, Hixson froze, holding up a hand. The air was still, too still. He pointed to a faint shimmer on a distant mesa. Riders, he whispered. 2 of them, scouts. Granger wasn't giving up. They were being hunted. Hixson quickly assessed their options. The canyon offered concealment, but also a potential bottleneck. We need to climb, he said, pointing to a sheer rock face, a challenging ascent even for a seasoned climber. Clara looked at the rock face, then at Hixson, a fierce resolve in her eyes. Let's go. They began the grueling climb, Hixson leading, testing each handhold, each foothold, before Clara followed. The sun beat down on their backs, sweat stinging their eyes, but they pushed on, their muscles burning, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Above them, the scout riders were drawing closer, their calls echoing faintly in the stillness. It was a race against time, against gravity, against the relentless pursuit. They reached the summit, gasping for air, their bodies screaming in protest. Below, the scout riders had stopped, their horses milling as they scoured the canyon floor. They hadn't seen them, not yet. Hixson flattened himself against the warm rock, peering over the edge. They're trying to pick up our trail, he murmured. Clara, lying beside him, her shotgun resting on the rock, nodded. They'll figure it out soon enough. This isn't a place to linger, Hixson agreed. They were exposed up here, but they also had a vantage point. He spotted a narrow ledge, almost invisible from below, that snaked along the cliff face, leading to a wider plateau. We'll take that, he said, pointing. It'll give us another mile, maybe 2, before they see us. They began traversing the precarious ledge, their movements slow and deliberate, a single misstep meaning a fatal plunge. The wind, now stronger, tugged at their clothing, threatening to unbalance them. As they reached the plateau, the scouts below finally spotted them. A cry went up, followed by the crack of a rifle. A bullet ricocheted off the rock near Hixson's head, showering them with dust. Move, Hixson yelled, pulling Clara forward. They broke into a run, scrambling across the uneven terrain, making for the cover of a cluster of thorny bushes. The scouts dismounted, scrambling up the cliff face, their progress slower than Hixson and Clara's. They had bought themselves some time, but the game was changing. They were no longer simply evading. They were fighting. Hixson unslung his rifle, turning to face their pursuers. I'll hold them here, he said. You keep going. Get to Last Chance Gulch. Clara shook her head, her eyes flashing. "No, we stick together. We'll find another way." Hixson looked at her, then back at the approaching scouts. Her resolve was unwavering. He nodded. "All right, but we do it my way." He had a plan. The plan was audacious and dangerous. Hixson knew this canyon like the back of his hand, a skill honed over years of tracking and evading. He led Clara to a narrow choke point, a natural funnel where the canyon walls pressed close. Here he had seen rock falls, knew the instability of the scree. He set up a crude ambush. Clara, with her knowledge of the terrain, would climb to a position above the choke point, ready to dislodge loose rocks when Hixson gave the signal. Hixson, concealed among a tumble of boulders at the canyon floor, would draw the scouts into the kill zone. "When I shout," he instructed, his voice low and urgent, "don't hesitate. Bring it down." Clara nodded, her face grim. She understood the stakes. This wasn't just about slowing them down. It was about stopping them dead. Hixson waited, the silence of the canyon broken only by the distant clatter of the climbing scouts. He could hear their labored breathing, the grunts of exertion. They were close. He gripped his rifle, his heart a steady drumbeat in his chest. When the first scout rounded the bend, his rifle raised, Hixson opened fire. The scout cried out, stumbling backward. The second scout, startled, ducked for cover. "Now!" Hixson roared. Above, Clara heaved against a massive boulder, its base already unstable. With a groaning sigh, it began to move, gathering momentum, dislodging a cascade of smaller rocks and scree. The scouts, caught in the open, looked up in horror as the rockfall thundered down the canyon walls. They scrambled for cover, but it was too late. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of crashing rock and terrified screams. When the dust settled, two figures lay still amidst the debris. Hixson checked his rifle, then glanced up at Clara, who was carefully making her way down. They had bought themselves time, but at a cost. They continued their journey, the memory of the rockfall, a grim reminder of the violence inherent in their pursuit. The landscape, once a silent observer, now felt complicit, its harshness reflecting their own. As they approached the outskirts of Last Chance Gulch, the signs of human habitation became more frequent. A faint wagon track, a discarded tin can, the distant bark of a dog. Clara's cousin, a grizzled old man named Silas, was a reclusive figure, known for his meticulous records and his distrust of outsiders. Getting to him would be a challenge in itself. "He lives in the old assay office," Clara explained, pointing to a cluster of ramshackle buildings nestled in a narrow ravine. "He won't open the door for anyone he doesn't know." Hixson nodded. Trust was a rare commodity in these parts, and hard-earned. They approached the assay office under the cover of darkness, the only light emanating from a single flickering lantern in a window. Hixson positioned himself in the shadows, his rifle at the ready, while Clara approached the door, her steps tentative. She knocked, a series of precise raps. A long silence, then a gruff voice from within. "Who's there?" "It's Clara, Silas, Clara Malcom." Another pause, longer this time. Then the creak of a bolt, and the door opened a crack. Silas, a stooped figure with keen, suspicious eyes, peered out. He saw Hixson, lurking in the shadows, and his eyes narrowed. "Who's your company, girl?" Clara quickly explained their predicament, her voice urgent. Silas listened, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, he pulled the door open, motioning them inside. "Come in, then," he grumbled, "before you draw the whole damn town." Hixson stepped into the dimly lit office, his senses on high alert. This was only the beginning. Inside, the assay office was a cluttered labyrinth of geological maps, mineral samples, and dusty ledgers. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and old paper. Silas, without a word, poured them mugs of strong black coffee. He listened intently as Clara recounted the events at her ranch, his eyes occasionally flicking to Hixson. When she finished, Silas let out a long sigh, running a hand over his balding head. "Thorn," he muttered, his voice laced with contempt. "Always looking for a shortcut. Always looking for an angle." He disappeared into a back room, returning a moment later with a thick leather-bound ledger. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing faded entries. "Your father, bless his stubborn soul," he filed a claim. A proper one. Had a surveyor mark it out, clear as day. He pointed to an entry, his finger tapping the faded ink. "This is it. The Malcom claim. Silver ore, high grade." Hixson felt a surge of relief. They had proof. But getting it out and using it would be another matter. "Thorn will have men here," Hixson said, his gaze sweeping the small office. "He won't let this get out," Silas snorted. "He already does. 2 of his goons were asking about Clara just yesterday. Said they were looking for a lost dog." He gave a humorless chuckle. "A lost dog with a shotgun, I imagine?" He pointed to a small, heavy safe built into the wall. "The original claim papers are in there, along with a few other things Thorn would kill for." He looked at Hixson, his gaze sharp. "You look like a man who knows how to handle trouble. You willing to earn your keep?" Hixson met his gaze. "I'm already earning it, Silas." The confrontation came swiftly, as Hixson knew it would. They hadn't been inside the assay office for more than an hour when the sounds of horses and men reached them. Granger. He hadn't given up, and he had obviously received reinforcements. "They're here," Hixson said, grabbing his rifle. Silas, surprisingly calm, handed Clara a small Derringer pistol. "For close quarters, girl. Don't hesitate." Clara nodded, her face set. Hixson looked at Silas. "Is there another way out?" Silas pointed to a narrow, camouflaged door behind a stack of crates. "Leads to an old mining shaft. Comes out a mile up the gulch, but it's unstable." "And dark." Hixson nodded. "It was a risk, but it was their best option. Clara, Silas, you go. I'll hold them off." Clara shook her head. "No, we're in this together. You cover us." Hixson looked at her, a moment of silent understanding passing between them. He admired her courage. He nodded, then positioned himself at the main door, his rifle ready. The door splintered under a heavy kick, and Granger's men flooded in, their faces grim, their rifles raised. Hixson opened fire, dropping the first man, then pivoting, his rifle barking again. The small office became a maelstrom of gunsmoke and gunfire. Clara, providing covering fire with the Derringer, moved to open the secret door. Silas, surprisingly spry, helped her clear the crates. Hixson fought with grim determination, his shots precise, his movements fluid. He knew he couldn't hold them off indefinitely, but he could buy enough time. A bullet grazed his arm, stinging, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on the fight. "Go," he yelled, seeing the secret door finally open. Clara and Silas scrambled into the dark shaft. Hixson laid down one last volley of fire, then, with a grunt of pain, retreated into the shaft, pulling the camouflaged door shut behind him, plunging them into absolute darkness. The mining shaft was indeed unstable, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp earth. They moved cautiously, Hixson leading, his hand outstretched, feeling for obstacles. Clara followed, then Silas, their breaths echoing in the oppressive silence. They could hear the sounds of Granger's men trying to force open the camouflaged door behind them, their frustrated shouts echoing faintly. "They'll figure it out," Hixson muttered. "We need to move faster." Silas, surprisingly, seemed to know the shaft. "There's an old hoist further in," he rasped. "Comes up in the old prospector's camp, just outside the gulch. Might be a cart left." Hixson nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. A cart. A chance. They pushed on, the darkness absolute, their only guide the faint, cool breath of air that signaled an opening ahead. They reached the hoist, a dilapidated contraption of rotting timbers and rusted cables. A small, rickety ore cart sat on a short track. "This is it," Silas said, his voice strained. "We lower ourselves down. It's a long drop, but it's the only way." Hixson examined the cables, testing their strength. They were old, but perhaps just strong enough. He helped Clara and Silas into the cart. Then, with a heave, he pushed it onto the hoist platform. "Hold on tight," he warned, then began to crank the rusty lever, slowly lowering the cart into the depths. The cables groaned, the timbers creaked, and the cart swayed precariously. It was a slow, agonizing descent, the darkness absolute, the fear a palpable presence. But they held on, their eyes fixed on the faint glimmer of light far below. They were getting out. They were making it. They emerged from the shaft into the fading light of dusk, into a deserted prospector's camp, a ghostly tableau of abandoned tents and crumbling lean-tos. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush. They were free for now. Hixson helped Clara and Silas from the cart, his arm throbbing from the bullet graze. "Last chance gulch," Clara whispered, looking back at the dark maw of the mine shaft. "We made it." Silas, clutching the ledger to his chest, nodded, a look of weary triumph on his face. "Now what?" he asked, looking at Hixson. Hixson looked out at the vast, darkening landscape. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but they had the proof. They had the claim. And they had each other. They found a single sturdy wagon abandoned in the camp, its wheels flat, its canvas ripped. Hixson, with Silas's surprisingly strong assistance, managed to patch the tires and rig a makeshift harness. Clara, ever resourceful, found a small stash of dried provisions and a couple of canteens. They worked through the night, their movements fueled by a shared sense of urgency and purpose. By dawn, the wagon was ready, crude but functional. "We head for the county seat," Hixson said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "File the claim, make it official. Then we take this to Thorne." Clara nodded, her eyes bright with a fierce resolve. "And we make him pay." Silas, clutching the ledger, climbed into the back of the wagon. "I'll guard this with my life," he declared. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in fiery hues, they set off, the wagon rattling over the uneven terrain. The air was still and cold, but a new day was dawning, and with it, a new sense of purpose. Hixson, driving the wagon, looked back at Clara, who sat beside him, her shotgun resting across her lap. They were no longer just a guard and a widow. They were allies, forged in the crucible of fire and pursuit. The road ahead was long and filled with dangers. Thorne wouldn't give up easily. But they had faced the worst, and they had survived. They had a claim, a purpose, and a bond that had been earned through courage and sacrifice. The land was the same, vast and unforgiving, but they, the weary travelers, were not. They had been changed by the trail, by the fires, by the fight, and they would ride on, together, towards a new horizon, ready for whatever came next.